The Oracle of the Forgotten, The Wandering Swordsman, The Great Awakening, Part 1. Nalia had been kept away from the throne room for most of the morning. That didn't entirely matter to Odilon because he'd been busy observing everything else. Demons and angels were coming and going now. Even beasts were starting to enter through the portals at the edges of the rooms. They would move around and guard the entrances and exits, investigating anyone who came in or left. The room was growing ever darker as the energies began shifting to allow these entities to enter the human realm. It didn't take long for him to observe that many of the villagers had been marked in one way or another, with deep red brands burnt into their skin by some anomalous source. The locations varied. He could see people investigating their bodies where the symbols had formed. Faces, hands, arms, even necks. Some were on the chest and others were in various, more intimate locations. It wasn't long before a marking appeared on him as well. It was painful, exactly like the times he'd been burned with a hot iron in the past. Only his would disappear, reappearing multiple times. Everyone else seemed to have it only appear once, but each time the marking on his chest would flare, burning his entire body to remove the other marking. He didn't want to think about it. This was pure torture, but perhaps unintentional. It seemed like the two markings were fighting for one another to gain space. After 4 or 5 attempts, the sigil finally settled itself at the base of his neck atop his shoulders, where it seemed to pulsate, bleeding slightly. He couldn't see it, but the swordsman could absolutely feel its presence, still trying to fight from time to time with the marking on his chest. It seemed whatever this ritual was that they were waiting on still hadn't begun yet. However, many strangers and even people he'd once encountered in his travels were now starting to wander into the building. It was likely that these people were all non-human, considering they'd been told by both angels and demons that no non-human could miss this event. The half-demon was struggling herself. The main difference was the sigil that had settled on the other humans never fully attached to her. Eventually, the energy somehow always severed and fell off. Finally, it stopped trying altogether. Despite that, she had learned enough from the energy to understand what was happening. It was clear that this was the work of one of the higher lords of the realms that had been marking people. She wasn't quite sure why. She had still suffered a certain amount of distraction from the constant illusions by the hand. Their efforts to keep her from fighting them back had included giving her meals and a few other gifts, but something about it all felt wrong. She'd begun to refuse to eat because even the food didn't seem right to her somehow. A little at a time, her half-demon mind was chiseling away at the illusions they had cast. Her own experience with them would be addressed at another time. If anything, she was in the middle of forgetting again due to the magics that were being used on her. Odilon was surprised to see Nalia enter with the hand. Vaishya was actually the one closest to her, as if she were trying to keep her separated from the men in their group. Nalia had been brought to the center of the room where Gawain had quietly been resting upon his throne. She didn't seem to see anyone else again. Her vision kept shifting. She was dizzy, off balance, and unsure which of the multiple images swarming her mind was the actual reality. If anything, at this point, she was beginning to feel as if she'd been drugged. Still, there was this cold rage that had begun boiling within her for this constant refusal to let her see the swordsman. She was currently dressed in a flowing white gown, one that seemed to accent her figure and dance around her with an unseen wind. Her own building anger caused it and her hair to flow slightly with the changes in her energy. Even now, she was struggling with the spell that was cast to keep her from seeing and hearing the prisoners and her beloved. The woman marched towards Gain. Once again, she demanded that she be allowed to speak with Odilon. The man let out a small laugh before speaking. for which you stay so blind. But it doesn't matter. The awakening is about to begin. Why not have a seat and enjoy the show? As he spoke, he raised a hand. Suddenly, black tendrils wrapped around her body, dragging her closer to the throne. She could sense them now. The others in the room were drawing her out of the illusions. She still couldn't see them, but somehow the grasp of the energy bands around her woke up something inside of her for the second time that day. The first had already been mostly forgotten due to a spell. The woman made a choice, though. She glanced up at the ceiling a moment. The sun was directly overhead, shining through a hole that had been cut into the ceiling itself. Soon the sky would be darkening. She wasn't sure how she knew. She turned her eyes towards Gawain before she spoke again. This also moved the blade into her field of view. The voice that came was hers, but at first she wasn't entirely sure. If you do this, you will only force the prophecy to become real. She settled her eyes on the sword now. She could sense it, feel the energy pulsing within it. It was impatient and hungry. She found herself ready to speak again as she listened to the sword humming softly in the back of her mind. She couldn't quite recognize the tune, but she knew the words next to leave her lips were entirely her own soul speaking. I am not the one you will come to fear. As soon as those words left her, she felt a sudden tearing within her, as if something shredded through her entire right side. She blinked a few moments, but that's when the sound hit her ears, the soft moans and complaints of the hungry crowd nearby, the breath of their lungs, the energy of the thousands that were caged in this room. She felt something else, something more important, and the first time she heard his voice, it was telling the angel to leave the side of his cage. Her eyes settled on Vaishya. The woman was so close to what she desired, but she didn't care. He had held his own against her advances. Instead, her eyes settled on Odilon, and for a moment, softness touched her gaze again. Odilon could feel something, though. The blade was whispering, speaking through his mind, through his blood. It was warning him that Nalia was dangerous, more dangerous than before. If she turned on the mortals, he would be the only one in this room that could stop her. Odilon understood. Whatever purpose the blade had, it had always protected both him and the humans that he meant to keep safe from all of these inhuman creatures. But the words of the priest about a child also echoed in his mind. Could he kill her if she were carrying their unborn? He wasn't certain, but there were many things he was uncertain about. He needed the blade to answer. When he asked, the blade only told him it would not matter. Odilon taunted Vaishya now, half offering her a hope at touching him, in exchange for opening the gate to that cage. At the moment, he was entirely unaware that the half-demon had broken through her own illusions. Nalia's attention was on that, rather than the man standing next to her. Gawain grabbed her and spun her to look at him. You are to be our guest. Pay attention. You'll get to see the rise of the Hand of Gods. You will witness the return of the golden and eventually the lost. The man began to pace now. As he did, the half-demon felt a change of energy through her. He wasn't human, not even close. Half at best, and an angel at that. She narrowed her eyes. Normally her desire to kill his kind overwhelmed her, but in this place they were suddenly all equal. In this place, she could feel the energies shifting. Gawain held up a small object in the slowly fading light of the coming eclipse. The sun was still bringing light to the world, and the crystal in his hand was shimmering, glowing an intense red before flooding the room with the same color of light. Nalia felt the beam cut through her. It was like it was driving itself into her form. She understood now that it was meant to help change her and the hybrids in the room that had not evolved yet. The woman suddenly didn't know what to do or what came over her. She wanted it to stop. As she tried to find a quick solution, she could feel something inside of her starting to change. Darkness, light, it was mixing and stirring in her energy, and it wouldn't stabilize. That instability, though, for most it may have been crippling. For her, she felt a burst of power and suddenly realized she had an idea. She struggled against the tentacles banded around her body. That didn't work. She growled and then focused her mind enough to pull the light from the crystal into the bands that were wrapped around her. This worked. In fact, it cut through them cleanly and she found herself free. She was moving on instinct now, unsure of where to turn. She only thought of a weapon. She wanted to fight. She needed a weapon. Her mind could only focus on one, an impossible weapon. She rushed towards the throne, grabbing the sword with both hands. The sudden action seemed to freeze the gaze of everyone around her. All the others had died trying to touch it, and even Odilon expected the result would either be nothing or she'd end like any other non-human who took it in their hand. What he didn't expect was to hear the voice of the blade fill the room with two words: "Not you." The girl spun, moving quickly to guard herself from the two guard who had noticed her holding the weapon. She managed to swing the blade, removing their hands from them. Still, she was uncertain of this voice. In the depths of her mind, it just kept repeating to her, "Return the blade." The ritual couldn't be interrupted now. Gawain knew the danger, but chose not to move. Instead, he used the crystal and began opening portals to both the light and dark realms throughout the entirety of the building. Tentacles began to appear in some of the cages. Sometimes demons would appear with them, reaching to kill the humans by causing direct injury through the location of their marking. The room was beginning to smell of wet earth and metal. Nalia moved to the next stage of her extremely limited plan. She spun again, this time releasing the blade, which flew forwards, cutting open a portion of one of Vaishia's lower wings. It also knocked off a piece of her armor, turning the angel's attention fully on the now unarmed girl. The sword itself ended up lodging into the lock for Odilon's cage, and he finally saw that he had the chance. He stood, rushing forward to retrieve his blade as the first set of tendrils from the ground tried to grasp where he had just been seated. The events around him were now a blur. Despite that, he was fully aware that the hand of the gods had gathered around both Nalia and Gawain. Having completed his part of the ritual, Gawain had turned and knocked her to the ground, and she was still picking herself up when Odilon ripped the gate off with his bare hands and pulled the blade from the ground. Vaishia had retreated slightly to tend to her wounded wings. Other guards had closed in on the cage, all of which were quite swiftly cut down by the mortal. As the ceremony continued, he found himself cutting down a series of guards, one after the next. He had lost count by now. The humans around him were being slaughtered, and he no longer felt he could actually save them. The feeling was expressed as pure rage as he began cutting through angels, demons, and beasts that were standing in the throne room. The ceremony had continued through the eclipse, opening a large number of portals between the realms and this one. In fact, unseen from the room, they'd begun to take over most of the lands outside of the stronghold of Trist. For a moment, the single sun was blocked entirely by the moon, and the world seemed to go dark. The only light was from a few remaining candles around the room. In this moment, too many things happened all at once. Odilon was well into cutting down 50 or more of the angels and demons in the surrounding area. Dozens of beasts were already at his feet. Dust was starting to fill up the room when the darkness fell. In that moment, Odilon felt a giant hand reach for him, grabbing him and pulling him tightly into a grip that he could somehow not escape. He was burning now, the fire of his new brand pouring blood down his back. His original brand was searing his flesh, burning through him in a way he had not experienced since his earliest memories of fighting these creatures. Whatever held him was powerful, powerful enough to momentarily take hold of his blade and throw it aside like a toy. He was moved instantly to a place one side of the room where Vaishya was more than eager to see what she could do next. After all, this had been promised to her as payment. Nalia had been somewhat subdued temporarily. She hated that her clothes were missing. She couldn't stand being so exposed. Her clothes had been taken from her in the darkness, and she was just as undressed as all the other sacrifices in this room. She knew with no weapons, no clothing, she was reliant on the skills that she was least confident with. Gawain had been looking her over now, his eyes taking on a golden flare as they never had before. There was golden light surrounding him as well. He had begun his ascension, but there was more that needed done to assure his power. He had other goals and interests now. After all, this new power, this new energy needed tested with a conquest, and they still had someone to break. He knew he would find a bit of pleasure in both the woman before him and the fact that the man he hated most was going to have to watch him claim her for himself. In the coming moments, Odilon had been bound by the entity that had captured him. It turned out that entity was Demasu. The blade was not too far from the throne again. Nalia had thought to grab it, but she felt the same bands wrapping around her body. These were not held by the man who had bound Odilon. They were golden and wrapped around her body like ropes, binding her tightly as they held her in place. Gawain had his fun designing them to accent her in the best ways he could think of. She was his piece of art now, his to admire and hold, at least in his own mind. The only issue was this thing within her. It was a part of Odilon, and he was not having any of it. He moved closer to the woman, suspending her in the air as he spoke. I will claim what is mine, but first this abomination within you must be dealt with. The field of energy that began to burn through her had centered itself directly over her womb. The woman was still unaware of the unborn within her. This sudden attack, though, made her all too aware. If anything, she was still in shock and unsure, even unable to respond. Despite that, a second energy began to counter the first. While Vaishya had decided to place herself upon Odilon to claim her rewards, the god that held him had to release his grasp in the attempt to save the host body he had chosen for the lost. Nalia, in her own fit of rage, forced her energy outwards as well, forming a whip that cut deeply into the cheek of Gawain. Golden red blood fell down his face before dripping to the ground. The man was too distracted by the intervention of the nearby god to really appreciate the rage that was growing at her, cutting his face open. That same whip of black energy spun towards Vaishya, but it didn't have time to do more than just strike the middle of her back. Odilon had quickly broken free, and her audacity to force herself onto him, the man decided to punch her before finally throwing her off of him. Now free, he walked to where she had landed and broke her neck. To the horror of those standing nearby, he took her head from her body and threw it to land at the feet of Paziel, who was the closest of the hand to where he was standing. Vaishya would pass on, forcing a rebirth somewhere far from their lands. The others would be required to find her later. This blood, though, the blood of one of their own, shook the portals, seeming to energize them in a way that had not been foreseen. All of the portals shattered, killing any who were transitioning through them. An instant later, a single large portal opened outside of the stronghold, a replacement to all others that would allow any level of energy to pass between these realms temporarily. Odilon had meant to rescue Nalia and the child. He was still a little uncertain of the story until the priest had taken his time to protect it. He knew there could be no doubt now. He needed his sword, and he rushed towards it, but he was suddenly stopped. The Lord of Plague was now standing before him. Deep spikes of black and green energy raised up from the floor, impaling the mortal. His throat closed, cutting his voice off so that he could not speak. Parts of him began to feel numb, nearly paralyzed. Again, he was silently cursing himself for becoming overpowered. He knew that he needed to pull himself free. Tendrils and vines grew up from the ground, binding the mortal yet again, forcing him to look in the direction of the throne and the nearby altar. Paziel began to clean up the mess now, allowing his energy to flow through and choke the humans who'd begun to fight back. One after the next, mortals began to fall to the ground, unable to breathe, unable to speak. Some developed sores on their faces and bodies, painful lesions that would prevent them from moving with any speed in an attempt to escape. Still, the entity did not speak. He walked over near his friend and stood beside Ozen, seeking protection from the sorcerer as he continued to destroy the will of the creatures around them. Their growing despair in the room seemed to empower Ozen. He drew it in like breath. As soon as he took a deep breath, dark red tendrils of energy flowed into his form. He was not the most powerful, but misery was fuel to him. Along with Paziel, he used it to suppress the masses. There was time needed for the next stages. If they could not complete their goals, this would become a whole lot harder in the near future. Paziel was casting a series of grand illusions to keep the outside from seeing what was happening in Trist. To them, it would look like no more than the odd thunderstorm. If at all possible to sense anything, humans would sense it as a strange energy, but not how powerful the entities here now are. Both stepped to safe distance as they saw the human break free. They knew whatever was coming next was nothing anyone could have predicted. They believed that this could be the end of them. The two warring hands of the gods were fighting for the unborn child, and one lost. He was thrown backwards into the crowd where he fell to the ground. He stood again, dusting his priestly robes. He would make the Golden pay for this betrayal later. For now, the show had to continue or they would lose this chance. It was time to break her, and seeing her after he had won was even more fuel to Gawain. The man tore her from the air before throwing her down to the ground. She was pale now, weak from the child that had died inside her and becoming more ill by the moment. She struggled and fought back against him, managing twice to escape the man, and he finally had enough. Like so many before him, he began to slam her head down into the altar. Repeatedly bashing her skull was causing her to lose consciousness, and at this point a good bit of blood, as she was only partially recovered from previous assaults to her head. The woman was fading again when she raised a hand, muttering something in a tongue that, when spoken, caused the sword on the floor to glow. It was as if each word had activated more within it. The sword lifted itself, opening a deep, black gash in the world. So dark the light seemed to funnel in around it. Even staring at it, there was no sense to it. No energy, no essence, no presence. It was only consuming the light, eating away at the energies of the room. It was pure. It was nothing. It was the void itself. The blade had, at her command, split reality to access a portal of true void power, and no one in the room fully understood what that might mean. Once done, the blade floated closer to Odilon, but then stopped, resting only a short distance from the portal, as if waiting and observing. The mortal was still bound, but whatever had happened had broken him partially free from that spell. He reached for the nearest guard's blade and began to cut himself free from his bonds. As he did, he noticed Nalia had stopped moving now. Blood trailed along the altar she was laying on, and the events unfolding before him put him into a complete rage. What kind of man could have allowed this? How could he consider himself worth anything if he couldn't protect them? But listening to his thoughts, the blade had stopped moving. It hovered in the air, only the smallest distance from the portal. The human shook his head, screaming in rage as he continued to cut himself free. He was grasped again by another set of tentacles and tendrils. One cut across a large portion of his face. Still, he managed to slice himself free of it as he pulled himself loose. There wasn't time. The second tendril that wrapped around his arm seemed impervious to the blade in his hand. He sliced at it over and over, trying to break free from captivity. He eventually gave up and decided that severing his arm would be the better alternative. By the time the blade had nearly hit his bone, something changed. It began to glow with a fierce black energy he'd never seen before, not from any mortal forged weapon. The man watched the blood-soaked blade easily cut through the thing that was holding his arm. His left arm was useless now, but he no longer cared. He continued to fight his way to where the ancient blade was held. With that blade, he knew he could save her. He knew he could save them both. Maybe even some of the ones still living within these walls. If he could not, then he knew that he would avenge them all. Demasu appeared between him and the blade, thinking that he could stop the mortal from reaching it. Like the other lord before him, he was quickly felled by the mortal blade instead. His head was cut from his body with such ease, the mortal realized he never should have questioned his worth. If anything, despite the ruining of this mortal form, he still had the strength to challenge these gods, with or without that blade. If he had the blade, though, he would end them all, just as the blade before him had said to. He had nearly found his way to the sword when the portal of darkness suddenly drew in all the light in the room for a moment. All light but the glowing of the sword and the glow of the golden bands on the altar that held Nalia. A large, gauntleted hand reached through the portal, grabbing a hold of the blade. The armor was an eerie black, with blue runes much like the blade itself had. It was followed by an armored joint that seemed to rest upon a nearly emaciated arm. Barely any flesh covered the bones that could be seen through the joint, and even that was quickly closing to protect the body that was within. The being that stepped out was taller than Odilon, probably only by a half of a foot, if that. In fact, the hand that grabbed the blade seemed to adjust to fit that form as well. The entity stepped out, glancing around. He was different than anything the swordman had ever experienced. Instinct drove him to attack, slashing at the creature with no intent other than to kill it and retrieve the blade. But as he did, the mark on his own chest made him freeze. An ice-cold blast of energy flowed through it as it started to shift. to turn, to spin as if it had come to a life of its own. The mark pulled him upwards and then tossed him to the ground, where he quickly recovered his human blade again. I am not your enemy. Not yet. The man holding the blade turned to Odilon. Take the girl and leave through the portal. You will have your revenge later. It sounded so simple, but how easy it would be remained to be seen.